Hello everyone. In this session we'll learn about exceptions in Python. What are exceptions and how to handle them? Exceptions are errors that occur during program execution, disrupting normal flow of execution. Exception handling prevents program crashes by managing errors gracefully. After this session we'll have a deep understanding of exceptions. We will learn how to use the try and except blocks and handle multiple exceptions and the use of finally and else blocks. Now let's take a look at what exceptions are. An exception is an event that interrupts the normal flow of a program. It occurs when Python encounters something unexpected or invalid. When an exception occurs, Python stops executing the program and raises an error message. There are different types of exception that are caused due to many different reasons. Let's see a few of them. The first one is due to any invalid operation like division by zero. If we divide any number by zero, then we get a zero division error exception. Next, we have exceptions caused by incorrect data types. For example, if you want to add a string and an integer. Since the data types are different and do not allow for such an operation, we get a type error exception. Next, if we try to access non-existent elements. For example, if a list has only 5 elements, but we try to access the 10th element, then we get index error exception. Lastly, if we try to access a file in any incorrect manner. For example, if we try to open a file that doesn't exist, we get a file not found error exception. Similarly, many more exceptions can be thrown because of many different reasons. Next, we will see how to handle these exceptions inside the code. For this, we will first create a new Python file called exception handling. Let's write a program to raise an exception. We'll write a short code to divide a number by 0 so that we get a zero division error exception. We have a number num equals 10 followed by a simple print statement print dividing numbers. Next we divide num by 0 and then print the result. Now let's run the code and see the output. Here it first prints dividing numbers. Next we are dividing 10 by 0, which is mathematically undefined. Python throws a zero division error and the program stops execution immediately. Any code after this line is never executed. The next question is, how do we fix it? To handle exceptions, we use the try except block. This prevents our program from crashing by catching errors and responding appropriately. First, let's have a look at the syntax for the try except block and then we will add it to our code. We have two separate code parts. First, the try part followed by a colon and then the part of the code that might throw an exception. Then we have the except part that catches any exceptions that might be thrown and within it the code to handle the exception. Let's rewrite the same code to divide the number by 0, but this time we will handle the exception. So first we have the try block as try followed by the colon. Within this we will have the code to divide the number by 0. So I'll just copy paste it from the previous code. Then we will have an except block which will expect a zero division error exception followed by a colon. Then we'll output the message cannot divide by 0. Let's run the code and see what happens. So, in this example, the division by 0 is placed inside a try block. At first, Python prints the message dividing numbers. Next, when Python encounters the exception, it jumps to the except block and prints the custom error message cannot divide by 0 instead of crashing. Without the try except block, the program crashes as soon as it encounters an error. With the try except block, we are presented with an opportunity to handle the crash in the except block. The program does not crash but handles the crash gracefully with some user-defined code. Next, we have the else and finally blocks to execute additional code in exception handling. The else block runs when no exception occurs. Let's write a small program that asks the user to enter a number. So we have the program where the user is asked to enter a number of type integer and then we print the number. Let's run this and enter a string instead of a number. As you see, we get value error exception stating that an integer is expected but a string was provided. Now let's update the code to handle this exception. We need to place this code inside the try block as try colon and then the code to ask the user to input the number. And then we also have an except block expecting a value error exception. Except value error colon print invalid input, please enter a number. And then at the end we can place the else block. Else colon print. Great, no errors occurred. Here the else block runs only if the try block executes successfully, meaning no exception was raised. If the user enters a valid number, then the else block prints a success message. Great, no errors occurred. Let's run the code again and see the results. Now if we input the number 10, we get the output as you entered 10 from the try block, and since the try block was executed successfully, the control goes to the else block and we get the message, great, no errors occurred. Next we have the finally block. The code within the finally block always executes irrespective of whether the try block executes successfully or with exceptions. In the example for division by 0, let's add the finally block and see what happens. After the except block, we have the finally block as finally followed by colon and then the output message. This will always execute no matter what. Let's run this and see what happens. First it prints dividing numbers, then the exception occurs as 10 cannot be divided by 0. Python then prints the message cannot divide by 0 as the control goes inside the except block. Lastly, it prints the message this will always execute no matter what from the finally block. Now let's change the code a bit to divide 10 by 2 instead of 0. And when we run the code, we see that the message dividing numbers is printed first. Next, the division of 10 by 2 is calculated correctly and is printed in the next line as result colon 5. This means that execution inside the try block was successful and no exception was raised. Python skips the except block and goes inside the finally block and prints this will always execute no matter what. As mentioned earlier, the finally block executes no matter if an exception is raised in the try block or not. On the other hand, else block is executed only if the try block is executed successfully and skipped if there is an exception thrown. In this session, we learned that exception handling is essential for writing robust programs that don't crash unexpectedly. By using try, except, else, and finally, we can gracefully manage errors and ensure smooth program execution. Thank you.